people. For its role in the bombing and its history of other terrorist acts, North Korea was designated as a state sponsor of terrorism from '88 to 2008. In 2008, North Korea was taken off the list of state sponsors of terrorism, not because most of the reasons cited in the State Department had changed. Instead, the decision, to me, was purely diplomatic and based on the nuclear agreement reached as a result of the six-party talks. North Korea was to freeze and disable its nuclear program. In exchange, the United States would remove North Korea from the state sponsor of terrorism list. The agreement fell apart because North Korea did not hold up its end of this bargain. Since 2008, North Korea has made significant advances in its nuclear program. North Korea conducted 2 nuclear weapons tests since 2008, one in 2009 and one in 2013. Earlier this month, there were rumors of yet another test in the works that may come. The other reasons the State Department cited for keeping North Korea on the state sponsor of terrorism list for 20 years are still relevant today. North Korea's history of abducting Japanese citizens in the 70s and 80s. Some of these kidnapped Japanese are still unaccounted for. North Korea has maintained its support for terrorist organizations. North Korea harbored Japanese Red Army terrorists who participated in the hijacking of a jet in 1970. These terrorists are still living peaceably in North Korea today. In 2009 alone, 3 North Korean arms shipments bound for terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas were seized by the UAE, Israel, and Thailand. In 2014, Western security sources reported that Hamas brokered an agreement to purchase communications equipment and rockets from North Korea. Hamas fighters reportedly used North Korean anti-tank guided missiles against Israel as recently as 2014. A U.S. District Court ruling in 2014 determined that North Korea materially supported Hezbollah's terrorist attacks in Israel in 2006. And without objection, the chair will submit to the record the United States District Court for the District of Columbia, the plaintiffs in cause of action 10-483, where the federal judge, and I quote on page 4, the court finds by clear and convincing evidence that Hezbollah carried out the rocket attacks that caused plaintiffs injuries and that North Korea provided material support. North Korea provided Hezbollah with a variety of material support, including a professional military and intelligence training and assistance in building a massive network of underground military installations, tunnels, bunkers, depots, and storage facilities in southern Lebanon. And it continues, and that'll be a part of the record. North Korea ties to these terrorists do not end with the weapons sales. North Korean experts advise both Hezbollah and Hamas in the construction of their terrorist tunnel networks. Beyond its ongoing ties to terrorist groups, North Korea remains a major proliferator of weapons of mass destruction. North Korea has cooperated with Iran on ballistic missiles since in the 1980s. North Korea is now believed to be working on an intercontinental ballistic system. If fully developed, this missile could drop a nuclear bomb as far away as the United States. There is growing evidence that Iran and North Korea are cooperating on developing nuclear capabilities. North Korea helped set up the nuclear reactor in Syria, which could have been used to produce plutonium for a nuclear weapon. Since 2009, several North Korean shipments of equipment used in chemical weapons programs have been redirected to Syria. U.S. government officials have also said that North Korea provided nuclear material to Libya in the 2000s. North Korea engages in the harassment, abduction, and murder of refugees, dissidents, and foreigners attempting to help North Koreans defect. The most prominent of these cases is the abduction and murder of Reverend Kim Dong-sik, a U.S. permanent resident from northeastern China. North Korean cyber attacks have reportedly targeted the websites of the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, Federal Aviation Administration, and others. Last year, North Korea carried out a cyber attack against Sony Pictures that included a direct threats against its employees and warning to, quote, remember the 11 of September 2001. Meanwhile, the administration has been exercising a policy of, quote, strategic patience against North Korea. As a judge, it certainly wouldn't have been good policy for me to have strategic patience for the criminals committing crimes in Texas. North Korea has not stopped sponsoring terrorism, even if our government has said it has. The Kim regime not only fails to take substantial steps to combat terrorism, it's provided weapons and other support to designated foreign terrorist organizations. So North Korea is still manufacturing weapons of mass destruction, and its nuclear program has grown more advanced than in 2008, so it appears that North Korea's actions have gotten bolder and more flagrant. So the purpose of this hearing is to consider putting North Korea back on the state sponsor of terrorism list. The chair now yields to the ranking member from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman Poe, for conducting this hearing, and thank our witnesses for being here today. North Korea is a rogue state which engages in all sorts of nefarious activities. This is not in dispute. The North Korean regime is involved in international organized crime, perpetrates terrible human rights abuses on its own citizens, and continually engages in internationally provocative actions. Its nuclear capabilities remain an even present threat for its neighbors and for the United States. North Korea has not held back from conducting nuclear tests, engaging in cyber attacks, and ratcheting up military tensions with South Korea. North Korea's continuation of its nuclear and ballistic missile programs is a direct violation of numerous UN Security Council resolutions and previously held commitments. Even more disturbing, because of the regime's desperation, its need for hard currency make proliferation and extortion an ongoing threat. With these violations in mind, I, along with Chairman Poe, co-sponsored legislation introduced by Chairman Royce in this Congress to improve the enforcement of sanctions against North Korea. It's important that we, along with our allies, uphold our commitments to North Korea's denuclearization. It's also important that North Korea face consequences when intentionally engaged in prohibited activities. With respect to North Korea's ties to terrorism, I remain concerned about reports of potential recent North Korean support of Hamas and Hezbollah, and reports of attempted and successful kidnappings and assassinations of North Korean dissidents living abroad. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses regarding these reports and, more generally, how the State Department currently assesses whether North Korea is a state sponsor of terrorism and what factors it considers when making this assessment. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, for an opening statement.
Thank you. This hearing raises a number of questions. Clearly, for reasons both prior speakers have indicated, North Korea deserves to be on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. So we'll want to know why we took them off, why we haven't put them back on, and why Congress just sits by and lets the executive branch make all the foreign policy decisions, where in this case the decision to take them off and leave them off is so questionable. But then we look at House leadership, which seems to be putting us in a position where the Foreign Ops Bill is going to be presented to Congress in a way in which no member of this committee can offer an amendment. No member of the House will be able to offer an amendment. And I look forward to working with people here to make sure that just because you stick it in an omnibus bill doesn't mean you can have a whole year, or in this case several years, of foreign ops appropriations with no member of the House and certainly no member of the Foreign Affairs Committee being able to offer an amendment. Decade ago, North Korea wanted a non-aggression pact with the United States. We turned them down because we don't do non-aggression pacts, which is perhaps the silliest reason not to do it. Just, well, we don't do that here. Now they want a peace treaty. I don't think we should give it to them unless we get something in return, but to dismiss it out of hand seems absurd. We've taken them off the terrorist list. I don't think we got much for it. I want to focus our attention on we had hearings in this subcommittee with my Asia subcommittee and others on the North Korea-Iran alliance. I got to spend an hour with the president in the Oval Office. It's amazing how nice the administration is before you announce your position on the Iran deal. And I spent most of that time focusing on the possibility of a transfer of fissile material from North Korea to Iran. Well, where are we at present? We've got one country that desperately wants nuclear weapons and is about to get its hands on, let's say, $100 billion plus of money. We have another country that has nuclear weapons and fissile material and desperately needs money. What could go wrong? Certainly, just North Korea's nuclear involvement with Syria and Iran is reason enough to put them on all of the lists. Israel, roughly 5 years ago, 6 years ago, took out the Al-Kabar nuclear facility. The sole purpose of that facility was to help Syria and or Iran develop nuclear weapons. At that time, North Korea was unwilling to sell, or apparently unwilling to sell, fissile material because I think they need about a dozen nuclear weapons to defend themselves from us, or at least the speculation is that that's what they think they need. Well, now they'll be creating enough fissile material for 4 additional nuclear weapons every year. Now, I'm not saying their 13th weapon goes on eBay, but they've already sold for hundreds of millions of dollars nuclear technology to Syria and or Syria and Iran. One would suspect more Iran than Syria. And now Iran has a lot more money, and North Korea has more fissile material than it needs as its minimum defense requirement. So I think we should focus not only on what terrorist and proliferation activities North Korea has engaged in, but what they're likely to do in the future. I thank you for the time, and I yield back.
Without objection, all the witnesses' prepared statements will be made part of the record. I ask that each witness keep their presentation to no more than 5 minutes. I'll introduce each witness and then give time for their statements. Then questions will follow. Ambassador Kim is the Special Representative for North Korean Policy and the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Korea and Japan. Previously, Ambassador Kim served as Special Envoy for the Six-Party Talks and is a former prosecutor. Mrs. Hillary Bader Johnson is the Deputy Coordinator for Homeland Security, Screening, and Designations in the Bureau of Counterterrorism. Ms. Johnson oversees the designations of foreign terrorist organizations and individuals under authorities of the Secretary of State. Ambassador Kim, we'll start with you, and you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me today, along with my Deputy Coordinator Johnson, to testify about the global security posed by North Korea. North Korea's provocative and repressive policies and actions constitute one of the most difficult and complicated challenges the United States faces. Mr. Chairman, we share your concerns about the grave threat posed by North Korea. Multiple United Nations Security Council resolutions require North Korea to abandon its nuclear and ballistic missile programs and prohibit countries from engaging with the DPRK to buy or sell weapons and related items and technologies. North Korea itself committed to abandoning all nuclear weapons and existing nuclear programs in the six-party process. Yet, North Korea continues to violate these commitments and and obligations through its pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, and its proliferation of weapons and technologies abroad. This conduct poses a growing threat to the United States, our friends in the region, and the global nonproliferation regime. We are committed to using the full range of tools, deterrence, diplomacy, and pressure to counter the threat and to make clear North Korea will not achieve security or prosperity while the regime pursues nuclear weapons, abuses its own people, and rejects its obligations and commitments. We have refused to respond to North Korean provocations with concessions. Instead, since 2009, we have tightened sanctions and consistently underscored to the DPRK that the path to a brighter future begins with authentic and credible negotiations that produce concrete denuclearization steps. Part of our effort to change North Korea's strategic calculus is maintaining the strongest possible deterrent capabilities. The DPRK should have no doubt that the United States stands ready to defend our interests and our allies. In this, we could have no better partners than in our allies in Seoul and Tokyo. We have made it a priority to modernize these alliances for the 21st century, and this important goal was reaffirmed during the recent visits here by President Park and Prime Minister Abe. By maintaining credible deterrence and by applying sustained sanctions pressure on the regime, we increase the cost to the DPRK of its destructive policy choices. Vigorous sanctions enforcement is the key to cracking down on North Korea's proliferation activities, which finance and facilitate North Korea's dangerous programs. Strong sanctions implementation also helps prevent North Korea's weapons from spreading, potentially destabilizing other global hotspots or reaching groups that would seek to harm the United States and our allies. We, of course, monitor very closely all available intelligence on North Korea's global arms trade, and we take action together with our partners to mitigate those transactions and to impose consequences on those responsible. In January, President Obama issued a new executive order giving us an important, powerful, and broad new sanctions tool. We immediately began using this executive order to apply additional pressure on wrongdoers in the DPRK. Imposing sanctions against the DPRK's primary intelligence agency known to be responsible for its cyber operations, as well as its main arms trade agency and several of its overseas arms dealers. And we will continue to use this new tool along with our other sanctions authorities. Our sanctions are always more effective when supported by our partners, and so we have focused on strengthening multilateral sanctions against North Korea. The sanctions that we have successfully pushed for in the United Nations Security Council give countries the authorities they need to crack down on North Korea's proliferation networks. When North Korea's major shipping firm was involved in an illegal weapons shipment, we led efforts at the United Nations to sanction the firm. Since then, the company's ships have been denied port entry, scrapped, impounded, or confined to their home ports in North Korea, and the shipping firm has lost its contracts with many foreign-owned ships. We have engaged countries across Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East that have been targeted by North Korea for proliferation-related activities, reminding them of their obligation to implement United Nations sanctions and strengthening their capacity to do so. As a result of our outreach, key countries have re-emphasized their commitment to the United Nations Security Council sanctions and have taken some positive steps on enforcement. We also continually review all available intelligence to determine whether North Korea is subject to additional measures. Naturally, this includes reviewing available information to determine whether the facts indicate that DPRK should be designated as a state sponsor of terrorism. Equally important is North Korea's political isolation, driven by the overwhelming international consensus that North Korea cannot fully participate in the international community until it abides by its obligations and commitments. We have built that consensus through our active and principled diplomacy, and that diplomacy, of course, begins with our partners in the six-party process: South Korea, Japan, China, and Russia. Our coordination ensures that wherever Pyongyang turns, it hears a strong, unwavering message that it must live up to its obligations. Mr. Chairman, holding North Korea accountable and combating its illicit activities required a sustained and international effort. We and our partners will continue to deploy the full range of tools, deterrence, pressure, and diplomacy to counter the threat and to lead Pyongyang to different choices. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear today, and I look forward to your questions.
Chair recognizes Ms. Johnson for your opening statement. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to join my colleague, Special Representative for North Korea Policy Sung Kim, to testify today about the process for designating a country as a state sponsor of terrorism and North Korea's designation in 1988. Special Representative Kim already expressed our shared concern for the global security threat posed by North Korea and summarized clearly our policy and tools of deterrence, diplomacy, and pressure. So with the Chairman's permission, I would like to briefly outline the criteria and the process for designating a country as a state sponsor of terrorism ahead of our broader discussions. First, in order to designate a country as a state sponsor of terrorism, the Secretary of State must determine that the government of such country has repeatedly provided support for acts of international terrorism. The standard for applying and rescinding this designation are set out in the 3 separate statutes: Section 620A of the Foreign Assistance Act, Section 40 of the Arms Export Control Act, and Section 6J of the Export Administration Act. The standard for designation is the same in all 3. In making such a determination, the Secretary's evaluation generally includes, but is not limited to, the following criteria, and if I may, I'll read those as well. Allowing the use of its territory as a safe haven from extradition or prosecution for terrorist activity, furnishing arms, explosives, or lethal substances to individuals, groups, or organizations with the likelihood that they will be used in terrorist activities, providing logistical support, such as transportation, to individuals, groups, or organizations involved with terrorist activities, providing safe houses or headquarters for any individuals, groups, or organizations involved with terrorist activities, planning, directing, providing training, or assisting in the execution of terrorist activities, providing direct or indirect financial backing for terrorist activities, and providing direct or indirect diplomatic facilities, such as support or documentation intended to aid or abet terrorist activities. A state sponsor of terrorism designation is made only after careful review of all available evidence in its entirety to determine if a country meets the statutory criteria for designation. Such a designation involves a number of laws, and the four main categories of sanctions of an SST would include a ban on arms-related exports and sales, restrictions over exports of dual-use items, restrictions on foreign assistance, and imposition of miscellaneous trade and other restrictions, including potential liability in U.S. courts for acts that fall within the terrorism exception of the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. The Secretary of State designated North Korea as a state sponsor of terrorism on January 20th, 1988, for repeatedly providing support of acts of international terrorism, particularly the bombing of Korean Airlines Flight 858 on November 29th, 1987 that killed 115 people, and the Rangoon bombing of 1983 that killed 17, including 4 South Korean cabinet ministers. After a thorough review conducted in accordance with the relevant statutory criteria for SST rescission, on October 11th, 2008, North Korea's state sponsor of terrorism designation was rescinded. In May 2015, the United States recertified North Korea as a country not fully cooperating with U.S. counterterrorism efforts pursuant to Section 40A of the Arms Export and Control Act as amended. In making this annual determination, the Department of State reviewed North Korea's overall level of cooperation with U.S. efforts to combat terrorism, taking into account U.S. counterterrorism objectives with North Korea, and a realistic assessment of North Korea's capabilities. Of note, the standards are different for certification as a not fully cooperating country versus the designation of a state sponsor of terrorism. The determination of whether a country is not fully cooperating is made based on a review of the country's cooperation with U.S. counterterrorism efforts, whereas again, a state sponsor of terrorism determination is based on whether a country has repeatedly provided support for acts of international terrorism. In addition to annually reviewing North Korea's certification as a not fully cooperating country, the Department of State regularly reviews the available information and intelligence on North Korea to determine whether the facts indicate that it should be once again designated as a state sponsor of terrorism. These judgments are not based solely on the news of the day, and we look systematically at what's been done to make these determinations. In conclusion, I would like to thank you and the subcommittee for the opportunity to appear today, and along with my colleague, Special Representative Kim, to outline the state sponsor of terrorism process and its history with respect to North Korea. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you both. When North Korea was put on the state sponsor of terrorism list, and whatever the reasons were it was put on, which of those no longer apply today in 2015?
So when we rescinded the SST designation, we again go back through the statutory criteria, which require us to go back 6 months at the listing for the review and determine. And so at this point, from 2008 on, we again review all credible information, all information and intelligence from all sources, and again we look to corroborate that, make sure.
So which of those that were
credible.
available to you that you said, these are the reasons we're putting them on the state sponsor of terrorism, which of those no longer apply in 2015?
Well, I would have to look at what exactly was included in the rescission package, but again, for rescission, it is really only a looking back for the statute requirements, is looking back at 6 months. Did they commit any acts of international terrorism? And they also must produce assurances that say they will not commit or provide support for international, for acts of international terrorism going forward.
All right.
That is the requirement for the SST statute for rescission.
Ambassador Kim, does North Korea have nuclear weapons?
So I think in this setting, it's difficult for me to answer clearly, but obviously we're very concerned about the advances they have made in their nuclear program.
And are they developing ICBMs?
Well, again, very concerned about the advances they have made in their delivery capabilities.
And are they working with Iran in the development of ICBMs?
So we have long been concerned about relations between Iran and North Korea, and this is a matter that we watch very closely. We have a number of sanctions, both multilateral and U.S. sanctions, that prohibit any such dealings, and this is obviously something that we will pursue vigorously whenever we have credible information.
Ambassador and Ms. Johnson, are you familiar with the District Court for the District of Columbia case that I cited earlier, Kaplan versus Hezbollah case? I'm sure you've read it. Let me read you another portion that I have not read. From the district judge, July 23rd, 14. Moreover, North Korea worked in concert with Iran and Syria to provide rocket and missile components for Hezbollah, terrorist organization. North Korea sent this rocket and missile components to Iran, where they assembled and shipped to Hezbollah in Lebanon via Syria. These rocket and missile components were intended by North Korea and Hezbollah to be used, and were in fact used by Hezbollah to carry out rocket and missile attacks against Israeli civilian targets. Now, to me, that sounds like a terrorist act on the end. Would that information be used to consider or reconsider putting North Korea back on the state sponsor of terrorism list?
I'll go ahead
Either one or
first.
both of you.
No, I'll go ahead first. So I wouldn't want to comment on the alleged activities in the district court ruling. Again, I think and I believe that
Assume they're true.
But
Let's
so-
assume that's true. Whether you
I
agree
said-
or not, assume it is true. The judge says this, but I don't want to violate any security things, but assume that's true. Would that be as we called in law school, a weight factor to consider putting them back on the list of a state sponsor of terrorism?
So again, I would go back to the statutory criteria require us to look at all available evidence. We'd again look at unclassified information, press reporting, other information, including intelligence.
Okay.
And again, we would
Excuse
look
me,
at
Ms. Johnson.
verifying it.
You read the criteria. I gave you some examples. Would that fit the criteria?
I don't want to get into hypotheticals. So again, you would have to look at a variety of information and sources. Again, look if it's true, credible, corroborated, and you look at it in its entirety. So I can't speculate again on alleged activities.
Well,
and be able to
that
comment on
information
that.
is disturbing. Would you not agree?
A lot of activities in North Korea.
Mr. Kim?
If I may, if true, and I think you're asking us to assume that report is true, that allegation is true, certainly it would be a relevant factor for consideration in determining whether North Korea meets the criteria of having repeatedly supported acts of international terrorism.
All right. And my understanding is that the policy administration in dealing with North Korea is strategic patience. Is that correct?
Sir, no, I think the term strategic patience was used to describe an approach we were taking to any resumption of negotiations. And
Okay.
the idea was that we wanted to avoid the mistakes that had been made previously with attempts at negotiations with North Koreans. So we wanted to be more cautious about resuming any negotiations, that we weren't going to rush back to negotiations, that we weren't going to offer any concessions to North Koreans in order to get them to the table. We wanted to coordinate very closely with our partners. We wanted to deliver to them. We wanted to make sure that we gave us the best chance possible to actually making some lasting, concrete progress on the denuclearization. It was not meant to describe our policy. I think our policy is what we both described, which is the combination of deterrence, pressure, sanctions, as well as diplomacy.
All right. I'm out of time. I'll yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating. He talks faster than I do.
I'll try. We both have accents, just different ones. Again, thank you for being here. I just want to just dwell on one practical aspect of this. What practical effect would the designation of North Korea as a state sponsor of terrorism have? I mean, they're already heavily sanctioned. There's not many countries more isolated economically in the world than they are. So if this occurred, hypothetically, what other added restrictions would be in place? And what would be the effect if it was symbolic? Would that have a practical and an important effect too?
Well, again, if I may, so the SST designation leads to bans on arms-related exports and sales, controls over exports of dual-use items, restrictions on foreign assistance, and other miscellaneous financial and other restrictions. So when you look at North Korea currently, which is one of the heaviest sanctioned countries around, there's no real practically speaking, it would not enhance or necessarily alter any of the current sanctions that are applicable to the DPRK at this time.
What do you think in terms of a symbol or message that would make?
I think there's obviously some symbolic value in designating them as state sponsor of terrorism, but only if they actually meet the criteria for that designation. If I may, sir, I would just add, the flip side of your question is, did they gain anything when we delisted them? And I think the answer is the same, because as you pointed out, they're so heavily sanctioned already, both multilaterally and unilaterally. They really did not gain anything from delisting, other than whatever symbolic appreciation they might have had.
Yeah, just as a process, how does the department factor in this instance, North Korea, but in any instance, participation in cyber attacks and cyber crime when determining whether it's a designated state sponsor of terrorism?
Yeah, and I think cyber being new, since it's an important area.
Yes.
And so we would look at all of that information, and again, cyber acts is something we would look at. And again, we would look at the statute, its repeated acts, and again, if it meets the criteria. So again, looking at all intelligence related to a particular cyber attack, we would definitely take a look at it closely.
Yeah, and again, getting to the process as a whole of the designation, is it, some of the bad acts they're doing and some of the actors they're involved with are actual state sponsors. Can you comment on how the fact that these are state actors, how that might affect the designation process?
Well, and it's certainly alarming for us that the DPRK has close relationships with Iran and Syria, both state sponsors of terrorism. But again, we go back to the legal criteria, and we look at it very closely, of course, because these are state sponsors of terrorism. And again, look for repeated acts, and again, verifying and corroborating and making sure credible information exists if there's linkages there. And again, looking at the relevant criteria.
Yeah, now I know that we're limited. That's what's a little frustrating in a open setting. So to the extent you can follow through in a classified setting, of course. But touching on the support of Hezbollah and Hamas, what would that have as an impact and the designation to any country?
Right, and again, we would be very concerned with any relationships with foreign terrorist organizations. And again, we'd go back to look at, again, repeated acts. It sounds very process-oriented, but it is to make sure that the standard remains the same. Again, are they doing repeated acts for support for acts of international terrorism? And then again, looking at the intelligence to see if that backs it up to make sure that they have that.
Clearly, would you weigh it would be much more influential than perhaps state acts, working with state actions of
very much of concern of state sponsors of terrorism or FTOs.
All right. Well, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back because we're limited in terms of what we can ask in an open setting along the lines that I was going to pursue. So I yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. The chair will yield to the gentleman from California, Colonel Cook, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not an attorney, so I don't understand a lot of the process you're talking about. I know, and I thank my lucky stars every day.
Not either, if that helps. So.
But the answers you gave there about what you would have to do, I kind of get the feeling that it would take a nuclear event, and then it might take 6 months to examine the radioactive material that would be available before you made a decision. And I'm being somewhat caustic, maybe sarcastic, but it almost seems that you're very, very reluctant to establish what line they have to cross that they haven't already crossed, because I thought they would have met this based upon their past behavior and the terrorist groups that they're associated with.
Appreciate the question. I would definitely say that we take this very seriously, and seriously means we look again at all of the relevant criteria and intelligence and information, and I don't think we want to put countries on the list willy-nilly, so we do a very close examination of all the evidence.
Well, it's hard to think of another country that should be closer to the all-star list there that in terms of their behavior. And All right, we'll switch gears. I'm one of those ones that I think they're just gonna thumb their noses at us. But there is one country in the area there that can make a difference and will probably, and that is China. Do you agree with that, that if they were gonna change their behavior in a lot of ways, that the fulcrum point is China?
Sir, there's no question that China has a special relationship with North Korea, that they have significant leverage over North Korea. And we have urged China to exercise that leverage, use that leverage more effectively to persuade Pyongyang to start making some smart, positive decisions. Obviously, there's more that the Chinese can do. But I can assure you that they have made very clear publicly, including when Xi Jinping was here just a few weeks ago, that they remain committed to the shared goal of denuclearization and that they strongly oppose any actions by North Korea in violation of Security Council resolutions. We will continue to work with the Chinese to try to persuade them that they need to be doing more. They need to be doing more effectively to persuade North Korea back to some credible negotiations, to persuade them to take some concrete actions towards denuclearization.
So officially, the word from China to us is they will not get involved. That is my understanding.
Well, I don't think that's accurate, sir. I mean, I think
It's not? You just admitted, you said that they were the one country that probably has the most leverage over that. And they came here and everything, and if we asked them point blank, the one country there to make a difference so that they can perhaps save lives or cut down on this influence, and we don't want to go there, or am I misunderstanding this?
no, sir. I wasn't suggesting that the Chinese are not doing anything or that they're not working with us at all. What we have seen has not been completely satisfactory, and this is why we're continuing to remind the Chinese that North Korea's irresponsible behavior and repressive actions hurts China's own interest, and therefore Beijing needs to get more serious, more focused about persuading North Korea.
But they haven't done it yet, and they won't do it. Is that correct?
I think they're continuing to make an effort, but obviously less than satisfactory from our perspective.
Effort means they communicate to North Korea, hey, knock off the following events and do this. It's
Well,
in the
I'm
best interest of North Korea and China and everyone else to do it. Have they done anything? Obviously, I'm being allegorical here to a certain extent.
So I mean, I can tell you that Chinese efforts on sanctions enforcement and implementation have improved over recent years. Is it perfect? No. But we have seen tighter border controls. We have seen stricter controls over export of dual-use items from China to North Korea. So we have seen some
Well-
improvements, but we need to see more is what I'm trying to say.
Well, I'm running out of time here. I don't agree with you. I don't agree that China has leaned on them at all, and I don't even think they've agreed to the United States that they're going to lean on them. And I think they're the country that probably has the most influence, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from California. The chair now recognizes the other gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
I think the previous gentleman from California had it right. China is subsidizing North Korea, and China will occasionally send us a statement that says they love us very much and they wish that North Korea wasn't acting so badly. When we threaten or impose taxes on Chinese exports to the United States, we will get their attention. Until then, we will get statements that I describe as love letters. They may even have little hearts directly from President Xi saying that they love us very much and they share our goals. We may need to clarify the state sponsor of terrorism statute because, Ms. Johnson, is there any doubt that, let's say, Syria engages is planning terrorism, and they go to North Korea and say, hey, you guys have a special explosive that'll help us blow up more people. North Korea provides it to Syria, and Syria, not a non-state actor, Syria itself commits the act of terrorism and kills extra people because they've got the good explosive. Are you saying that under the statute it's unclear that that would get a country put on the state sponsor of terrorism list? After all, they didn't help a terrorist group. They didn't carry out an act of terrorism themselves. They just supplied special terrorist equipment to another state sponsor of terrorism.
And thank you for the question. I would say that, again, we look back to the statute which says repeated acts, that they would provide support for repeated acts of international terrorism.
Okay, let's say they did it 4 or 5 times, but all of their aid was to a state actor, not a non-state actor.
So we would look at the intelligence and the available information to be able to
So
see.
it's perfect intelligence. 5 times they helped Syria, they provided things to Syria that Syria used for terrorism. They're building the barrel bombs.
I don't want to get into hypotheticals, but I would say, again, we would look at all.
How can I
the-
possibly understand how you interpret this statute if we don't get into hypotheticals?
Because
I'm
again, you
asking
look
you a
at
simple question.
Right.
Is support for a state sponsor of terrorism a reason to put a country on the state sponsor of terrorism list?
Again, we would look at all of the
We would look
criteria,
at,
and we
can
would
you
look
give
at
me
the
an
information.
answer? Okay. Look, it's pretty obvious you're not following the statute. Mr. Kim, North Korea abducted Japanese citizens. Are some of them still imprisoned in North Korea, as far as you know?
So we don't have that information. In fact,
Have they returned the bones, or have they returned the people? In all of them, I know they've done on occasion.
no.
No.
They have not.
Okay. So I would think that kidnapping Japanese citizens is a act of terrorism, not only on the day you kidnap them, but a month later when you're still holding them, 10 years later when you're still holding them, 2 decades later when you're still holding them. Ms. Johnson, I'm trying to understand this 6-month rule. Countries on the state sponsor of terrorism, but they periodically issue statements saying they don't believe in terrorism. So they've met one of the 2 prongs. The other prong is they have to go 6 months without engaging in a terrorist act, or at least us knowing about it. Let's say a country meets those 2 standards. The intel briefs you and says, it's been 6 months and a day since they've engaged in terrorism that we can document, and oh, by the way, here's a copy of their most recent statement opposing terrorism. Under those circumstances, are you saying you can take them off the terrorist list, or you're required by law to take them off the terrorist list?
So there is nothing under the statute that talks about reviewing. The not fully cooperating country list, for instance, there's an annual review, and if you don't recertify, you're off the list.
Right, okay.
So for the statutes, that is not the case. If there is a review called, we look back 6 months prior to the call for the review for any acts of international terrorism and for support for
And let's
acts
say
of
you look
international
back 6 months and you don't see any, do you then feel legally compelled to give somebody a get out of jail card free because it's been 6 months and a day? Or is it just optional with the State Department?
We provide the recommendation to the Secretary of State, and then that would go to the.
Are you required to recommend that a country be taken off the state sponsor of terrorism if, for as far as you know, they've gone 7 months without blowing anything up?
I believe the answer is yes, and I could get back to you on that, but yes.
Well, please get back to us, although, as to North Korea, every day that those Japanese citizens are not returned is a continuing act of terrorism. Every day that that the bodies of those who died in North Korea are not returned is a continuing act of terrorism. So even if the law is as you describe it, the recommendation of your Bureau to take North Korea off the state sponsor of terrorism was certainly unjustified legally. And then as far as a matter of politics, or international foreign policy, hey, North Korea said it would disable its nuclear installation in Yongbyon. It did. Then it didn't, and they're still off the list of terrorists. I'm not sure that the removal is justified as a matter of foreign policy. I yield back.
The chair will have another round of questions from members of Congress. We'll go 2 minutes this time instead of 5. Chair will yield to Colonel Cook, California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to switch gears a little bit. And I understand that the North Korean Chamber of Commerce and China has probably given them a 5-star rating for being good guys. But don't we have the U.S. military that has top secret intelligence flying, satellite data, U-2s and everything else? And when you talk to the military, and if you asked them that question, they'd probably say diplomatically, not in our area. But then they would tell you things and reasons why you couldn't sleep at night and why the threat is so great. And they would also talk about their affiliation with certain terrorist groups. Do you guys talk to the military and get that same take that we get, maybe not in Foreign Affairs, but the House Armed Services Committee, where we get an analysis of a particular country? And all I've gotten is, boy, if North Korea doesn't qualify for that list, then no one does.
Well, we look to the entire intelligence community, and so.
But my question, does the military come to you, and do you have that exchange that we're having right now? Or is that something outside your realm?
No, we're consistently looking at the intelligence and the information, so if military is coming with information, yes, we would.
But do you have meetings together where you would have a dialogue like this?
We talk to the military intelligence frequently on a number of countries, and we do have discussions with them regularly, yes.
So if I may, I think from our side as well, we remain in very close touch with our military colleagues. I served as U.S. Ambassador to Seoul until just recently, and I know from my own experience that the communication between us, the embassy, and U.S. Forces Korea continues every day, and it's very much focused on the threat posed by North Korea. And same thing in Washington. I stay in very close touch with my colleagues in the Pentagon, and we share information about threats posed by North Korea.
Well, as somebody who was in the military a long while, I had a different take on it than you did. So obviously, my 26 years in the Marine Corps was wasted because I'm very, very worried about North Korea. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to try a thread of questioning that I started, and Mr. Sherman tried to start, and maybe this will yield an answer, because we're interested in whether the process needs to be altered in any way. So in the instance that we both led some questioning on, where it's a state actor that's involved, and it's repeated sufficiently, and it's credible, would you be precluded from the designation because it's a state actor?
If a country meets the criteria and we have the intelligence, again, to support that criteria, we would make a recommendation, yes.
Okay, so
Secretary
you're
of
not
State.
precluded by
But
that.
again,
I think that
yeah, I mean, hypotheticals are hard to answer in.
Oh, I'm talking generally, not about North Korea in this instance.
But again, the criteria, I think, there's no definition of acts of international terrorism, so we've pulled from the statutes and legislative history
Right.
and then
So
utilized
the
that
state actor
criteria.
designation doesn't preclude.
So at SST, a foreign
Possibility.
terrorist organization. Yes.
Great. And just one other question, because we're talking about sanctions and other issues. And I know this, but I'd be interested in Ambassador Kim's comments, that might be more recent or relevant. They're among the most repressive countries in the world with its own citizens. Terrible human rights abuse of its own citizens. How is our intelligence, to the extent that we can talk about this, is there dissent among the people? Is there a significant feeling against a country that acts like this? Are there indications that is increasing recently?
Thank you. I think it's difficult to tell. You would think that there would be dissatisfaction, dissent among the North Korean public. But North Korea remains a unique place. In many bad ways, it's a unique place. I mean, the information flow is very limited. The regime remains one of the most brutal. So I think it's difficult for North Korean citizens to express dissent, dissatisfaction in any way that we would be able to detect. We're certainly, obviously we monitor very closely developments on the ground, and we're not seeing any indication of any movement from the North Korean people.
Okay. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair yields to the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
Mr. Johnson got a hard question, but it'd be easy right now, and that is, I'd like you to furnish for the record, from your bureau, an analysis of how you interpret the law. When are you required to list a state as a state sponsor of terrorism? When are you allowed to do it? When do you have to take them off the list, if ever? When are you allowed to take them off? And I'll ask you to have a series of hypotheticals. If country A, you don't have to name any countries, takes the following action, then we are required to list them, we're allowed to list them, we're required to delist them, we're allowed to delist them. Because it's our job, when necessary, to rewrite statutes, and if we don't know how you're interpreting this statute, we don't know whether it needs to be rewritten or not. Now, in a perfect world, we would just quickly write a new statute that would be so clear we wouldn't have to ask you how you interpret it. I've learned that Congress is not a perfect world, and if you're interpreting the law in a certain way that seems to be correct, you'll save us a lot of time in trying to improve it. Ambassador Kim, there's a tendency for us to say, well, the guys that are the bad guys just do bad things and have no moral compass at all. It's been my experience that bad guys don't think they're the bad guys. And they have their own compass as distorted. I mean, it may be pointing due south. And in looking at North Korea, they seem to be very legalistic. And they seem to care whether we have a non-aggression pact with them, not that would stop a single division from moving north. They seem to care about whether they're designated as a state sponsor of terrorism, when, in fact, if we took them off the list, that would not improve their economy in any way I can ascertain. And now they're pushing for a peace treaty. And even if we had a peace treaty with them, God knows they engage in activity that would justify unpeaceful activity in the future. How much do they care about these three things, and why? What's their internal thinking?
Thank you very much, Congressman. I think that's a very important question. Frankly, I'm skeptical about their call for a peace treaty, because I think they understand that we have certain fundamental requirements. I mean, they would need to denuclearize, they would need to abandon their pursuit of dangerous delivery means, missile capabilities, and they would need to improve their human rights situation. I mean, I cannot imagine any circumstance in which we would enter into a peace treaty with North Korea that continues to reject international obligations and commitments. So they know that. So for them to be proposing a peace treaty negotiations without addressing the core issues that we care deeply about, frankly, it's disingenuous. So it's hard for me to tell that, sort of decipher why Kim Jong-un is so focused on this. But I agree with you completely that they tend to be very legalistic. And this is, I think, one of the lessons we learned from our previous efforts in negotiating with the North Koreans, is that we really have to be very careful in drafting these documents and entering into any side agreements, because they are very much focused on the most minute details and looking for loopholes wherever possible.
Just a couple more questions. I think we're voting now or soonly. Thanks again for both of you being here. There was a report back in the early 2000s, that North Korea set up a nuclear reactor in Syria and then provided nuclear materials to Libya. Assume that's true. Would that fit the criteria of abetting the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, which is one of the issues to determine whether somebody should be on the Foreign Terrorist Organization state sponsor of terrorism list? Is that right, Ms. Johnson, or not?
The FTO list and statutes are different.
I know.
So for
I
state
meant
sponsor-
state sponsor of terrorism. I'm not trying to make North
Combine
Korea
the two.
a foreign terrorist organization. State sponsor of terrorism is the key here. Would that be a criteria for putting them on the list?
Again, I think we look at everything very closely, and I know
But
that's,
would it be one of the things that you would look at? This fact?
yeah, we would look at it very closely and make sure that it's repeated acts for support for international terrorism, and again, evaluate the criteria and look at it holistically and as an entirety. Because again, I think it's very hard to do hypotheticals without looking at it.
Okay, how about cyber attacks? That was mentioned, but I'm not sure I understood the answer. Would
So
that be a
cyber
new
attacks-
criteria now that you could consider to put a country on state sponsor of terrorism?
Again, we would review cyber attacks just as closely as any of the other acts. And again, for cyber attacks, those are possibly, you could look at them in a variety of different ways depending on what we're talking
Yeah,
about.
some
as
of
far
us
as
look at
cyber
them as an
attacks.
act of war.
So again, we would look at it against the relevant criteria and again, in its entirety.
And
And
there,
repeated acts is an important element.
Ambassador, I understand there are 3 countries that are on the state sponsor of terrorism: Iran, Syria, and Sudan. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is there anybody else that we don't know about?
No.
I mean, that I don't know about. Kim Jong-un had a press conference apparently some time ago, maybe it was last year. During the press conference, he had behind him a chart or a hit list of things he wanted to destroy. It's kind of personal to me that his first target on that list with his ICBM capability that he wants was Austin, Texas. I take that a little
Why
personal.
Austin?
And that
Yeah.
was my question. Why Austin, Texas? But bigger than that, it seems to me that the government is doing everything it can to be a bad actor in the world. They're helping all the bad guys. They want to be a bad guy. They want nuclear weapons. They want to help sponsor terrorism, Hezbollah, Hamas. When I was with Pacific Command not too long ago, the Admiral, I asked him the question of the 5 countries that are threats, or the 5 entities: China, North Korea, Iran, ISIS, Russia. Which one are you the most nervous about? He told me North Korea. He was the most concerned about, because you never know what they're going to do. So anyway, I want to thank both of you for being here. We will have a classified hearing at some later time. We'll have more members, and we'll have that hearing. Thank you both. We're voting now, and
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
we're adjourned. Court's over.